say some things, very brief things, before we open up to Q&A. Okay, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Duncan Wood. Getting a little bit of feedback there. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first event of what I call the fall season. Feels like we're at the Met or something that way. Easier to raise money if you talk about seasons, you see. And we're delighted that this first event of our fall season actually involves one of our former scholars, Alfredo Corchado, presenting his new book, Homelands, which if you haven't seen it, I've got a copy right here, but there are lots of copies over here on my right, your left, which you can purchase. And they've been incredibly kind enough to bring a credit card machine so you can do it like that. Or you can pay cash, but they inform me they have no change. So if you only have a 50, then it's not going to be a very good deal, I'm afraid. Actually, your book is worth $50. Okay?
That was 29.
So, it's a great delight also to be able to co-host this event with the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome, Andrew, back to your other home here in Washington. It's great to be able to collaborate on events as we did just a couple of months ago with your own book, and that was a delightful experience as well. And of course, Guadalupe, it's lovely to have you back here as well. You are a member of the family, both of the Mexico Institute and the Latin America program. You've been a great asset to us and a great friend as well. Now, it's always a joy presenting a book that was done, at least in part, here at the Wilson Center. An extra joy because it's the second book that you've been kind enough, Alfredo, to share with us. And also, of course, we have a triple celebration. As I mentioned, Andrew has just recently published a book, and of course, Guadalupe has also published a book. And so we have three distinguished authors here, and then there's me. But I'll do my best not to upset the balance of the universe here, okay? So we're going to have a brief introduction from Alfredo about the book, Homelands. And then we're going to move on to comments from Guadalupe and then from Andrew. I'll say a few very short things before we open it up to Q&A. Alfredo, let me just say that it's wonderful to have you as a colleague. As a professional, of course, you are an excellent writer. We all know that. We've read your stories, your articles, your books. And let me just say, to me, your stories really draw me in. That's something that I really admire about you. The angle that you take, the choice of your stories even, I think is kind of unique. And it comes from the point of view of the local. Not necessarily you as the local, but whoever is local in the situation. You managed to add that in, and that's terrifically helpful, I think. As a colleague, when you were here at the Wilson Center, you're very easygoing, you're incredibly productive, you're a great colleague, and I want to particularly point out that you are a great mentor to the younger members of staff. The younger full-time staff members and even the interns. They all said incredibly nice things about them, probably because you took them out and got them drunk, but but I admire that. And let me just say on a personal level, Alfredo's fun. I mean, you really are. You're a fun guy, and I don't mean a mushroom.
Why am I nervous right now?
Yeah, I don't know. No. You have a quiet way of interacting, which is almost conspiratorial, which I really like about you, because I feel as though whenever I speak to you, I'm getting inside information on something, because it's kind of whispered at me, which I enjoy that. But let me just say that this book is also deeply personal, and it's deeply personal in a way which doesn't draw you away from what you're trying to relate about Mexico, the United States, migration, etc. It draws you in. It gets you involved in a way. And there's one line which I wanted to call up just at the very beginning before I turn the microphone over to you. And it's from early in the book where you're talking about clothing and how you're trying to fit in, you're trying to buy the right kind of suit, etc., as opposed to the jeans that you usually wore. And you said, besides, regardless of what I wore, I couldn't mask who I really was. And I have to say, this book brings out, I think, who you are. And so congratulations on that, because this is very much a reflection of you as a professional. It's how I see you as a colleague and how I'm learning you are as a human being as well. So congratulations, and please introduce us to your book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center. As Duncan said, this is the second time, and these have been great experiences. I had invited Sarah to be here. Sarah Jones was an incredible researcher. Was it summer of 2006? So a lot of the research that's in this book. One of the things I really enjoyed about working on this book was all the historical context, and she spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress doing that. But I mean, this is, and that's not because Duncan or Andrew is here, but this is an incredible institute. If you want to write a book, if you want to research, I mean, this is the place.
And if you want to donate money at any point, it's a great place to donate money.
I guess one of the first things I want to do is explain why, when I was here, the book was called Shadows at Dawn. And I've gotten a lot of flack from friends who said, you know, I had written it down as Shadows at Dawn, and now it's Homelands. So let me just kind of give you a little bit of the story about that, about what happened. I left D.C. in, I think it was 2015, went to UCSD to work on the book, and the night of the election in 2006, I get a call from the publisher who said, well, several things happened last night. I think I don't think the book is going to work the way we thought it would work. And the very first problem you have is the title. The Mexican population is no longer in the shadows. There's a flashlight that's just, you know, it's on you, and you're going to have to own that. The first thing you're going to have to do is he said, how much more time do you need? I said, another year, maybe 2 years, to try to figure out what was going on in this country. And he said, you know, let's start with 6 months. 6 months is it, but the title's going to have to change. And we went back and forth, and finally settled on the title of Homelands. When he called me, I think it was something like 4 o'clock in the morning, he says, I got it, it's Homeland. And I kept thinking of CPB and ICE and all that. I said, there's no way I'm going to call the book Homeland. But he explained, you know, Homelands. He says, you need to own it. You are a binational person. You are a member of 2 countries. And the friends who are in the book, that's the binationality. That's what gives this book heft, you know. It took me a while. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, I was pretty depressed for a while, you know, just thinking Homelands. But the premise of the idea, the idea of the book was trying to, even before Midnight in Mexico, I thought, if I'm ever going to write a book, I mean, I think most reporters, Chris Lee here, I'm sure thinks about it. Chris Lee and our colleagues from Dallas, he's now at the Washington Post. But I think a lot of us at some point think, maybe someday I'll write a book. And I always thought that if I ever wrote a book, I would write a book to pay homage to my parents, the Bracero generation, the people who came here in the 1940s and who are now in their 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. And I wanted to dedicate a book to them. But every time I talked to an editor or something, you know, it just wasn't sexy enough. I'd like to think of Midnight in Mexico as a book that I needed to write, and Homelands was something that I wanted to write. I was at a book talk in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado, Tatter Bookstore, and I noticed that a lot of my relatives who have once lived in San Luis de Cordero, Durango, made the migration to California, the San Joaquin Valley. They were now living in Colorado, and I was fascinated. My cousin Mari said, "Let's maybe get together, have some tacos or something after your book talk." I go, "Shit, yeah, great, let's do that." Expecting 5, 10 people, more than 35, more than 40 people showed up, and I go, "What happened here?" And then they started talking about IRCA and how all that changed. And how people were now moving all over the country, and how people were now looking for better jobs, and the fields of California just wasn't going to do it anymore. And that sort of started spinning. My wheels started spinning. One of my cousins said, "Somos como una flor de capullo." I mean, Mexicans, it's like a rosebud. Mexico just never opened up for us. as beautiful as Mexico is, as much as there's this nostalgia for Mexico, it's a rosebud. And I remember driving back to the hotel that night and thinking, damn, that's a beautiful story. You know, that's the story. And I called my editor and my agent, and she says, well, yeah, but, you know, I'm not sure what the narrative is. Long story short, I show up in New York City, and this is how you come up with the book ideas. I was doing something. The assistant to the agent calls and says, "Hey, Jen is excited to see you tonight. This morning, and I hope you're ready with the next idea." I said, "I'm not here with ideas. I'm here to sort of celebrate Midnight in Mexico." And she goes, "You're in New York City. Everybody in New York City has an idea. You know, you have to have an idea." And I showed up. And I'm thinking, I started thinking, the braceros, paying homage to my parents and so forth. And she goes, well, what's the narrative? How are you going to tell that story? And I said, I have these 4 friends. We have a 30-year friendship. And we met on a wintry night in Philadelphia. And when I said that, it was like, oh, tell me more. And so for me, the 4 friends, 2 countries was really a way to try to tell a larger story, tell a bigger story. It was a way to say, in the backdrop of this friendship. It's a book about friends. It's a book about family, but really in the backdrop, you see the biggest shift that happened in the United States in the last 40 years. I arrived in Mexico. From Mexico to Ciudad Juarez in 1965. As a 5-year-old kid, hated the idea of coming to the U.S. because I lived the perfect life. My father was a bracero. Every 2 weeks without fail, he would send money. So we had money. We had a little grocery store. And I had the best job in the world. I would check on the toys, make sure that the toys worked. And it was there. It was, ahí llegó el señor el cartero, run and get the money. And that was my life. And so when the idea came that we were going to leave for the United States, it was crazy. President Johnson, in '65, had stood behind the Statue of Liberty, and they passed the 1965 Immigration Act, Nationalization Act, and that changed our destiny. That changed the deal for us. My father's boss, every Christmas, he would dread the holidays because my father was so good. He was such a good cotton picker. He was so good in the tractors that he always thought, if he leaves and he doesn't come back, I'm screwed. And my father would stop in El Paso, would buy little boots, Tony Lama boots, a little hat, showed up. I didn't even know his name. We all call him Señor. Oiga, usted. El Pajarito, because his band was called Los Pajaritos. And he was there for a month, maybe 2, usually playing. So we didn't really spend much time with him. But that was circular migration. People went back and forth. And when Johnson does this, my father's boss said, you know what? Why don't I sponsor your whole family? Your whole family can become basically green card holders, and we don't have to go through this anymore. And my mother still reminds me to this day that when she told us, I threw the biggest tantrum. I just cried and cried and cried, and I just couldn't believe that we would leave Mexico for this so-called American dream. So it's through the story, I try to, again, tell the bigger story. That there's the 4 friends, but try to tell the bigger story about the contradictions. The contradictions is a result of immigration. Whether it's 1965, whether it's 1986 with Turca. By the way, 1965, I was so homesick. We had left everybody back in Mexico, And I remember every week, every other night, people would show up, relatives would show up. Because even after the cutoff date, the demand for workers would never end. And I still remember as a kid, people knocking on the door, los rancheros, los meros, saying, we need more workers. Can you get the word out to Durango? Get the word out to Zacatecas, get the word out to Guanajuato, we need more people. And so from that point on, you had the undocumented immigration. I mean, to us, they were family members. To us, the coyotes were not organized members of organized crime, but they were neighbors. My mother would stay up and make enchiladas for them to show their gratitude. So the book is, it traces the migration, and also traces the increased integration and binationality that takes place on the human level. I mean, Andrew's book, excellent book, looks at more at corporate America and other stuff, but mine was more about the human context. But I remember one night, and I'll leave it with this. My mother comes up to me, and I would cry when I was a little kid, because we lived in a trailer house, and we lived with melon fields around, and we had tomato fields, and we hated tomatoes because they would always attract more rats more than anything else. So sometimes we would sleep outside, and you would have these rats outside. But I remember one day she comes and she wakes me up and says, "Mijo, they're all here now." And I didn't know what she meant, but he meant all our relatives were here now. And I go, that just, to this day, when I think about that, mi tío Güero, mi tío Alejo, etc. And for many years, many of them were undocumented workers. But again, there were always these faces where the United States would say, okay, we need immigration reform. We need to find a way to legalize this, legalize that. Leave it at that.
I think that's a very nice place to leave it. Thank you, Alfredo. Obviously, we'll come back to you in the question and answer session. But I'd like to invite.
I don't need to read, right?
Well, would you like to read something? I think it would be nice if you read something for us.
It's just a couple of paragraphs, but when I talk about how reluctant we were about leaving Mexico, part of that reluctance was we had the most nationalistic grandfather that you could imagine. My mother was only 11 when the prolonged drought in San Luis de Cordero, Durango, derailed it all. The drought had been going on for so long that locals still couldn't remember when it actually started. Was it 1950? Was it 1951? Or sometime after? But they do remember the clouds, dark, low-hanging clouds that swirled in magically and made promises they didn't keep. The clouds threatened rain, teasing farms and ranch families into a frenzy of hope and prayer, and then they would disappear, leaving them disappointed, kicking dust and pondering the future. The farmland turned to desert that seemed to stretch forever. Rivers turned to dust, cattle strained to feed. Arcadio Jimenez worried about 100 or so heads of cattle that foraged between San Luis de Cordero and Piedras. They were starving, no pasture to graze. He grew so desperate to feed them that he took to tying a tank of gasoline around his waist and spraying a nopal cactus with flames to turn off the thorns, the way a chef might crisp a creme brulee and make them edible for his cattle. One late morning, the hose broke and doused him in gasoline, so fast that he caught fire and was engulfed. His son, Che, 13, watched his father scream in anguish. The frightened teen threw dirt on him to tamp out the flames before getting him to a hospital, a clinic in Gomez Palacio, more than 100 miles away. But Arcadio was so badly burned that the doctors told him to go home and die with his family. Arcadio put on a brave face and ordered his children to stop crying as he drank sotol and tequila to ease the pain. He died a day later. A band showed up for his funeral and played his favorite waltz, Recuerdo, as he was buried next to his mother. His eldest daughter, Erlinda, led the funeral procession. "Here comes Arcadio Jimenez," she would scream, tears streaming down his face. "I was born on my grandfather's birthday. I should have carried his name, Alfredo Arcadio. But the family preferred just Alfredo, more modern and less of a reminder of those dark days that helped define our destiny. My grandfather's death changed everything and everyone's destiny. Arcadio's lifelong lessons to his 3 sons and 3 daughters were tested. Do not ever leave for the United States, he would tell them. No guest worker program was good enough for them. No promised job north of the Rio Bravo would ever fulfill them. The U.S. works you to death, and then they deport you when they're finished with you, he'd say. No mighty dollar was worth breaking up the family. We might be poor, he'd tell his children, but we'll always have plenty of food. If you try hard enough, Mexico will provide. Mexico had boundless possibilities. The United States was beneath their dignity. Mexico was home. With his death came cruel reality." And so I read that mostly to try to understand how the migration came to this family. And again, when you travel around the country, as I do as a reporter, you find someone from Durango, and there's always that network. And so our network was first El Paso, and then the San Joaquin Valley in California.
Thank you, Alfredo. Guadalupe.
Well, let me start by thanking all of you, the Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, for having me here, Andrew Seeley Migration Policy Institute, for inviting me. I'm very proud and very happy to be here, and honored to be commenting on a book and on the work of a person that I admire a lot. Let me start by praising the career of a man that I have admired very much throughout the years. Our work has met at some points, and I have known Alfredo for a while, probably more than we have had time to interact. But we know each other, and I definitely think that he is the best border reporter we have along the Mexico-U.S. borderlands, by far. And many of the people that I know, many of the young border reporters wanna be like Alfredo, and they admire his career, and everybody likes Alfredo. I don't think that I know somebody who does not like Alfredo.
I was going to say a couple zetas out there.
Yeah, well, but you know, the people. No, nobody talks bad about you. On the contrary, and you're a great writer. I was very surprised to find what I found here. Not very surprised because you're a great writer. I read your previous book very closely, and we had some interactions about that. But you always surprised me as a person who's very honest, very open, very sensitive, and not many people have that capacity, that honesty to present things as they are and as you feel. Sometimes when you're afraid, when you're sad, you're not afraid of showing who you are, and that's something important. One thing that's important to praise is also the title. I like the idea of thinking of homeland without this patriotic sentiment that we use this word here in the United States, or it has been used even to call a ministry, the Department of Homeland Security, with the negative connotations it might have for some people. But homelands, the way that you describe this is your home. The two countries are your home. You're part of these two nations. And I love the way that you play it out with this idea and the way that you describe, what does that mean? What the two countries mean to you? I would like to divide my comments into two, the personal and the political. The personal side of your account is really touching. there was some passages that I felt like I wanted to cry. Really, I don't want to say this, in a way that because I'm here. It's really because some of the things that you said meant a lot to me and made me feel the same way. We are from a little bit different generations. You're not so much older than I am, but my family. The connection with California. I have several members of my family who went to the United States the same way that your fathers went to the United States. This idea of picking up fruit in California, either strawberries or oranges or cantaloupes in this case. So you and me share story and share also the story of living at the border. This third country, tercer país, like Alan Bernstein has talked about, that make you feel in a comfort zone in a way, because we were born in Mexico, we work in the United States, you have lived longer in this country and were brought to this country earlier than I was, but some of the sentiments that you had, I have. Sometimes the way that I speak, or I cannot communicate the same way as I do in Spanish. And your description of how you felt when you went to Philly working for the Wall Street Journal after leaving the border. The border is a comfort zone for us, at least it's for me. Because I'm never too far away, never too close for two nations that mean a lot to me. The United States, I was educated here. I have done my career here. I have friends here that mean a lot. This country means a lot to me, with all the contradictions that I have, with all the emotions that this country mean to me. And you were the same, and you're a self-made man. You are the person, the perfect Mexican that we all want to become. And your friends, Day, Primo, and Ken, were representing the success of a Mexican in this country, or a second-generation Mexican, a Mexican-American like Ken, going to an Ivy League school, right? I remember this passage when you describe how you felt among your colleagues of the Wall Street Journal, how they came from Ivy League schools and how you felt that you didn't belong. This complex that we all have. I have the imposters complex. The minorities who feel that we are never too good and we are occupying a space we don't deserve because we don't dress as well, as we don't speak perfect English in my case, but we're here and we have achieved a lot. And when I read this story, it meant a lot to me. I never understood why in your other book you talked about Juan Gabriel and these two things that when you're talking about Juan Gabriel and the Eagles. And sometimes the way that I speak to you when we talk, or when we communicate by Twitter, we communicate in Spanglish, or half in English, half in Spanish. It's interesting, right? This combination. And when you talked about Juan Gabriel in your other book, because I didn't know you and I was a little bit suspicious of you, and I told you about that, I was like, why this guy likes Juan Gabriel? And then I realized where you come from. You come from the central border. Juárez El Paso, and everybody, all men, dance like Juan Gabriel when Juan Gabriel is being played. It's just something that's just from your region. And I understood that.
But Juan Gabriel was really, when I first listened to Juan Gabriel, it was in the fields of California. And I remember when people were really tired in the afternoons, people would los mayordomos would put Juan Gabriel, and then suddenly everybody got, worked up again, and you met the quota.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, okay.
Productivity.
Yeah. I understood what it meant to you. Yeah. I understood what tequila meant to you. In the beginning, I was like, I wasn't sure what to think of that. But then when I read this, I had already traveled along the border and understood that. And it's something that was interesting to me. It's just the difficulties, the contradictions, the personal sentiments that you have with one country or the other one. I have the same, and it has been hard for us to be in this country and to succeed. We have to leave many things behind. We have to leave our country behind. You talk about the perfect life that you had to leave. For the sake of your dream, you want to fulfill a dream, but you have to leave a lot of things, and sometimes personal things. Sometimes you don't get married because you have to continue working. It's very costly. I see 4 men, I don't see a woman, but it doesn't matter. This is your life. I don't expect that you talked about women in that book, but it made me feel that it is very hard to me, and probably harder because I'm a woman, and I experience many of the things, and I still experience many of the sentiments that you have, particularly at this time. You leave you leave this history of Mexican immigration to the United States from the Diaspora program to today, and you described it in a very interesting way. And now I'm going to go from the personal, and I can continue saying a lot of things about the personal and about this book. That's fantastic in many ways. But there's another important, very important component of your book, which is the description of Mexican or Mexican-American immigration. You talked about this in a perfect way, talking about Mexican-American. You're never, you're both. We're both. And this is important. You talked about the Diaspora program, and you described NAFTA and IRCA, because this is when the time that IRCA in 1986 started, and the amnesty by Ronald Reagan, and what did that mean, and what were the perverse effects of a policy that was considered at some time very successful, and it wasn't. It had unintended consequences. And you never are too ideological. I always thought that you were a super big supporter of NAFTA, but then when I read all the description, you describe very well the contradictions of a trade regime that has benefited mostly the United States, and the contradictions of an immigration system that allows Mexicans to come when it's convenient, but when it's not, bad times, Mexicans are not accepted. You were very, you were able to tell us the story in better ways. You understand immigration so well, and the complexities of NAFTA, drug trafficking, how drug trafficking increased after NAFTA, and what drives, drug trafficking. It's just also addiction, and if it's not marijuana, there's going to be more things. We have open borders for that. And there was one interesting passage that was important, that you call NAFTA as a loveless marriage. This type of marriages that can end. It's like today NAFTA, right? it made me think of what happens today with NAFTA. It can end, but it will never end, because even with all the dysfunctions of the functionalities of a loveless marriage, you continue with the dynamics. It's interesting how certain phrases in your amazing writing, make us think of so many things that we are right now observing, and we have observed, and we had. I've done this. I read this from an academic perspective, but this book helps me much better to understand the complexities of all these with your personal stories, but this is also a great way to inform ourselves of what has been this important, this what you call this wave of Mexican-American immigration, right? When we were few, and then some Mexicans succeeded, and what is now? We don't have this wave that you experience after the Diaspora program. So I definitely think this is a must-read book for everybody who wants to understand this process of immigration in the country. And I admire you a lot. And as I said, I think that you are the best border reporter on both sides. And your job and your work has been important for us. I think I told you yesterday when we were at the restaurant that your work has helped me. I quote you many times in my own writings. Academics benefit from the work of reporters who go to the field, and I have benefited a lot from your work in so many occasions. So I appreciate your work, not only this book, but your reporting. It has been very important, and the perception from a Mexican reporter who understands the country, who loves my country, because I'm more Mexican probably than you are, because you are right. Debatable. Yeah. Well, yeah. We have to talk about that. And congratulations for this amazing book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lupe. Andrew Seeley, your reflections.
My reflections. Well, Alfredo, it's a wonderful book. Let me start off by saying that. You and I started down the book writing process more or less at the same time. by the time you had finished your second book, I was just finishing my first one. So you've been immensely productive these years. But we've had a lot of time to talk about writing, actually, and sort of live through the writing experience together and even present our books together. But one of the things that I think about when I remember reading this, and I think I sent you this in a text. I remember being on an airplane. I have no idea where I was headed, but I was on an airplane somewhere when I finished reading it, and I sent you an email or a text. I think it reads like a novel, and it does read like a novel. It's really meaty and substantive, and there's a lot of facts and figures in there, but you don't really notice it because it actually flows like a novel. I mean, it feels like you're being carried through a story, and it's really, there is just a level of humanity in it and a level of personal narrative that really makes it a fun read. One of the things that I found fascinating in this book is your four characters are so different from each other. These are four, this is a story about the Mexican-American experience, and yet it's four different Mexican-American experiences, right? I mean, it really is lived in very different ways, radically different ways, actually, by people who move into the American mainstream, who move into the Mexican resistance, who move into the business community. In most 3 out of 4 cases, I think end up becoming very comfortable with being binational, right? In many ways, maybe in 4 out of 4, but certainly in 3 out of 4. But all in very different ways, and all with very different aspirations and different values and different goals. And despite the close friendship, there's a lot of conflict in it. For those that haven't read the book yet, by the way, there is a lot of conflict that sprouts up because you have different values and different ideas of what the good life is, and different ideas of what it is to be both Mexican and American along the way, which I thought was fascinating, actually. And you wrestle with the subtleties of that. I mean, you don't shy away from it. You actually play a lot with those differences. I can't speak in the same way as Lupita to the Mexican-American experience, although people have accused me of being a gringo mexicanizado or a pocho al revés or many other things, but I will defer on that. But let me say, I think the book, in some ways you come to the conclusion that you really can be both Mexican and American, and you can be comfortable moving back and forth. And I think 2 things have changed over time, and I wanted to play with those a little bit. One is I think Mexico has changed profoundly. Right? I mean, Mexico is a different country. Mexico has come to terms with its diaspora, Rafael, in different ways than I think in the past, right? I mean, not perfectly, and certainly, there are. I bother Rafael only because he's the Mexican consul general here, and has worked a lot on diaspora issues in the past. But there's I think for Mexicans there was a time when leaving Mexico was a sign of failure, right, or a sign of rejection. People have either rejected us or there are rejects who have left us. And I think people have come to admire those that have left, right, and recognize that there is a Mexico north of the border. Not universally, not everywhere. I could cite counterexamples, but I think there's a growing comfort level with the fact that 1 in 10 Mexicans, 1 in 10 people born in Mexico lives in the United States, right, and that's part of the Mexican story is happening north of the border, right, and that's begun to be a much more broadly accepted idea in Mexico. Yes, you'll still find some people who are uncomfortable with those who left. You'll still find some people who have crazy ideas about those who left. But overall, there is much more of a conversation going back and forth across that line than ever before. And Mexico has become much more of a modern and much more of a plural and democratic country. These are things that have something to do with that, much more of a confident country in many ways. I tell in my book the story of Tijuana, which was a city I lived in the 1990s. Tijuana becomes this, goes from being this sort of rough and tumble town to becoming this really cosmopolitan city, fascinating city. But the same thing could be said of Mexico City, right? The same thing could be said of many places in Mexico that have sort of have gained a certain amount of confidence as they've had to wrestle with their own plurality as a democracy, but also become somewhat more developed and simply come to recognize the other Mexico north of the border. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that Mexico and Mexicans in the United States have changed the United States, right? And there's this huge sort of reshaping of what it means to be American. And Mexico is the latest chapter in what is a long history of immigration reshaping the United States. And that's true in things, that go from investment and business relationships, cinema. I mean, 4 of the last 5 directors to win Best Oscar for director are Mexican. to just the personal interactions that Homelands talks about, Alfredo talks about in Homelands. I mean, food and music and language and family connections. The number of Americans. I've always wanted to see if we could figure out this figure. Ariel, maybe we should figure this out someday. My colleague Ariel Ruiz from Migration Policy Institute is back there, is figure out the number of Americans that actually have some family connection to Mexico. And I don't know what that number is. The number of Americans. I mean, we know that about 11% of the American population is of Mexican descent. But if you add in intermarriage, right, the number of people who, I mean, you'd have to bound it, right? A brother-in-law, a sister-in-law, and, you know, a cousin, you know, who is Mexican.
Story to write.
It'd be a great story. I mean, the number starts to grow, right? Yeah, I mean, that's actually a neighbor, you know, depending how you want to bound it, right? The number of people who have actually intimate contact with someone from Mexico in the United States, I think that number has probably grown quite a bit, right? Much more than the 10 or 11% of the, which is still a really large number, by the way, but it starts to grow into be a much larger number of people who have some sort of personal contact with Mexico, not because it's out there, it's the country next door, but because it's part of their family, right? And in many ways, and with this I'll conclude, you know, since we're very proud at MPI to be able to co-sponsor this conversation and things we think about all the time, you know, migration is changing right now. In some ways, when we talk about migration, we talk about immigration in this country, we constantly come back to Mexico. But in some ways, we may be at the end of the great Mexican, so the great Mexican migration is what it says, the fate of the Mexican-American migration, the great Mexican-American migration. In some ways, this book comes at the end of the great Mexican-American migration, right? Yeah. This is, I mean, could be wrong, but all signs seem to point to, and Teresa's nodding, you know what I'm talking about, you know, we seem to have, you know, every conversation about immigration in this country comes down to Mexico, and yet we know that most immigrants coming to this country are coming from China and India, right? Those are bigger than Mexico. Mexico is still by far and away the biggest piece of recent immigration in this country, right? About a quarter of all immigrants, quarter of all foreign-born are from Mexico. Still by far and away, I mean, there is a reason why Mexico matters in conversations of immigration, but, you know, whether we're talking about stocks or flows, if we're talking about flows, it's actually become a smaller piece, right? And even if we're talking about the U.S. Mexico border, obviously Central Americans have now become a bigger piece, certainly of the undocumented flow across the border, but also a significant piece of the overall flow to the United States. And increasingly, we're seeing Asia displacing Latin America as a place of new flows to the United States. And what that makes me think, going back to your book, is in some ways, you know, this is a book about immigration, but in many ways, it's also a book about reshaping of the United States, right? And it's worth saying, actually, that Mexico, by the way, has always been part of the United States, right? I mean, when I was looking at my book, one of the things, the fascinating insights I came across reading someone else was, and I wish I could remember who it was right now, but the fact that Mexican food, you know, what we call Tex-Mex and all that is actually, you know, Mexican food from the United States, right? That there's Tex-Mex that's purely commercial and sold to, you know, to urban palates in the United States, but there are elements of Mexican food in the United States that were created north of the border when Mexicans living in the U.S. and Mexicans living south of the border were separated. And so there's some part of Mexico that's always been within the United States. But Mexico obviously is a big part of the recent immigration flows. Much like, you know, Italy, Ireland, other parts of the world that have shaped the United States, African heritage, that have shaped the United States at different points. We may have less and less Mexican migration in the future, but Mexico is going to be a huge part of what shapes American culture going forward, a huge part of who we are as a nation, and that tapestry that is so permeable in the United States that though we fight over whether the U.S. is changing, whether people are changing our culture, as I think we've heard some people say in politics in recent ways, that in fact our culture is always changing, right? And our culture is always changing from the most recent migration, but also then the sequence that follows that, right? The second and third and fourth generations. And so as your book sort of finishes off that cycle of the great Mexican-American migration, it is now really that great Mexican presence in the United States, and frankly, that great American presence in Mexico. So thanks, and really a fabulous read. So if you haven't read the book, you will really read it in 24 hours, because it's just a great read. I mean, it just is, you'll learn a lot, but just read it for the fun of it, actually. It's a really, really good book.
Or for the music.
Or for the music, that too, actually. Yeah, the musical references that go from, you know, ranchera to Santana, so.
It's Santana.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Before we open it up for questions, and obviously a chance for Alfredo to respond, I wanted to just to quote some things from the book, because ultimately, as Guadalupe suggested, it's a very quotable book. As Alfredo was a quotable person, it's a very quotable book. And I thought about it first of all.
Compare the Ménage à Trois last week.
You liked that one, didn't you?
I love that quote.
I managed to slip in the phrase "ménage à trois" talking about NAFTA, and Alfredo loved it. So there you go. Anyway. The reflections of a bored
They're more
Englishman.
approving than others. I can see.
Yes. Well, that's fine. But I thought about it in terms of first of all, of the work that we do here at the Mexico Institute and the things that we talk about a lot. And so with reference to the border, Alfredo has some lovely, lovely quotes. The first one, the border is the home of the constant wretched refuge. I don't know whether that was a typo, whether it's supposed to be refugee. Yes, refugee. Our jewel in the desert, our Ellis Island in the southwest. And you use the term Ellis Island a couple of times in the book, and I like it a lot. And then later on, the border was where the heart of the immigrant experience began to form. It was the point of departure where immigrants dispersed to all parts of the country. They left to work and assimilate, to have children and build a new life, often filled with sorrow as they reinvented themselves. Now, I want to come back to that point of sorrow at the end in a couple of seconds. On the question of Mexico itself, which you talk about issues of economic development, history, food, drink, Juan Gabriel, as we've already talked about. But there was one element, one part of the story where you're talking about different views on the migrants who leave, And one of your friends, I forget who it was now, but had said, was critical of people leaving Mexico. And it brings to mind the idea of the escape valve. And we've all talked about this for so long. And I have to tell you that until I read your book, I'd thought about the escape valve in a very different way than how it's described here. I'd thought about the escape valve as being, okay, there's all these people who need work, the pressure's building up, and then they leave. And you thought, well, if they don't leave, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be a revolution, it'll be messy. But your friend describes it in a different way. He says it's a lost opportunity. If only they'd stayed, they would have forced Mexico to change. And I thought, that's a completely different, he's flipped it in my head. And so the quote is, every immigrant equaled a lost vote for change. This is an escape valve, which is not just economic, it's political. And I think that's a really interesting way that I hadn't thought about before. The coming together of Mexico and the United States, which is a large part of the story of the book, despite the attempts to separate them. And this just very simple quote, as you're traveling around the United States, everywhere I went, it seemed Mexico was closer than I thought. And of course, that's something that we've all discovered. In the most surprising parts of this country, or even when you're up in Canada, you're in a bitterly cold winter in Alberta, and you come across a little Mexican community, and it's just one of those things like Mexico is much closer than I thought. And then on migration itself, and I use the term migration as opposed to immigration because it's not just from country to country, is it? It's from region to region, from the southwest to the northeast and back to the southwest in your case, as you just mentioned, from California to Colorado. And, I'm not your classic type of migrant, but I've been a migrant, 3 times in my life. I've lived in Canada, in Mexico, and now the United States, and I'm a Brit. And I think that you sum up the migrant condition so well, and it harkens back to the idea of sorrow, which is, the migrant condition is about longing and belonging. And, for this, you say, for binational birds, finding home solely in one place was complicated. We were pulled in both directions. And I think that everybody who has been a migrant feels that. But you also say that migrants are universal. And that part of your story when you're talking about Hungary, you realize this is not just a story about Mexicans in the United States, this is about migrants around the world. Internal migrants, international cross-border migrants, etc. Early on in your story, you're talking about your own migration from the Southwest up to Philadelphia. And you say, on the verge of tears, I wondered whether by searching for opportunity, I was leaving behind what I cared for the most. And at what cost? Was it worth the separation? And I think that probably pretty much every immigrant and every migrant has felt that at some point. And lastly, this dichotomy about belonging. And it's from a lady called Mary that you interviewed. She says, "Sometimes I wish I had never set foot in the United States because you end up always comparing the two countries and you can't choose one over the other."
My cousin.
It's a beautiful quote, and I think that many of us have felt exactly that, that conflict inside us, you know? And of course, you go to the place which is exciting and has opportunities, and then you miss the place that you just were. And ultimately, you know, we've all gone back home, and we've realized that home is actually no longer home. It's not the same home that you left, you know? And I congratulate you because it spoke to me very personally, I have to say. So thank you very much. And I don't know if you'd like to respond.
The part about the sorrow, and I'm serious. I wish we had a tequila.
Angela, go to my office, bring the bottle.
I mean, just a couple of quick things from what Andrew and Lupita said. On Lupita, I used to be like you. I didn't like mixing up the languages. But I think with time, I realized that you become really part of two countries, and you become really, really comfortable in both languages. And so I remember when I moved from California to El Paso, I couldn't stand that Spanglish.
Yeah, me too.
But now I realize it's very much part of who I am. And what Andrew was saying, and it hit me because I didn't realize that Rafael was here. But in my career, in my life in Mexico, I mean, there have been very key people like Rafael and Carlos Gonzalez Gutierrez who have helped me because of Mexico's class system. And as an immigrant, when you go back, you know, it's not just the pocho, but it's a whole class system. And it was these people like Rafael and Carlos who really, really brought me out and said, "No seas güey, you're one of us," you know. And forever, I mean, I'm always very grateful to that because I think those experiences really helped change me. It's today when you go to Mexico, I mean, maybe because I live in La Condesa or I spend a lot of time in La Roma, but you listen to more English than you do Spanish. I mean, coming from Mexicans, I really like how sophisticated Mexicans are. I mean, it's a very sophisticated. They're very sophisticated people, very tolerant, very generous. Although I will point out that the more you see Mexicans deported back to Mexico, and you're seeing little communities like Little LA that are springing up, not just in Mexico City, but in LA, in Guanajuato. I'm curious as to how much tolerance the Mexicans will show. That's a story that I'm really curious about. And Duncan, on that line about sorrow, I mean, I think it was chapter 24, which to me was the hardest chapter to write. Let me just try to put it in context and why that came about. But this is last weekend, November of 2016, right before the elections, and my parents are beginning to think that maybe this person can win the election. And it is scaring the heck out of them. And because they've been hearing all the rhetoric and so forth. And I remember we were driving into Durango. I mean, anytime we go to San Luis de Cordero, we're always careful not to get there too late because you never know which chapel side is out. Is it the young kids? Is it the adults? So we were just hauling, and then suddenly my mother, I noticed that she was really, really quiet and very sad. And I said, "Mama, ¿qué pasó? You know, what's going on?" And she said, "You know, put some music on. Put some música que me llega al corazón." We go to Durango every year for Dia de Muertos. My sister died. She was very young, and so we go there to pay tribute to her. And I thought it was this memory that was making her very sad. And so we're driving in, and she starts pointing out to the rivers that were there, to the fig trees, to the vegetables, the agriculture, the cattle. And she started saying, mira, Freddy, allí era el árbol de los higos, and this is where we did this, and this is where we did that. And when you're young, you hear about the United States, and you think everything is great there, and you think everything is going to be better. And I'm just looking at her, and she says, did we do the right thing? You know, did we do the right thing? And I mean, I had my glasses on, but I started bawling. Because all these years, all these generations, she was the one convincing me that we had done the right thing. And suddenly she was questioning her sacrifice. And I started thinking, what's it like for millions of immigrants who leave not thinking about themselves, but thinking about their offsprings, thinking about their generations? And what happens when they're in the moment that, like today, when they start questioning it? And she says, maybe those trees would have grown. Maybe the drought would have ended. Maybe we would have had our own cornfields. And then I was kind of joking with her. I said, yeah, and maybe I could have been a merchant in Torreon. And then I had the narcos come over, and I was paying extortion. I was trying to bring her back to reality from the romanticism. But she said, it's not always over there. And we make too much of El Norte. And I wonder whether we did the right thing. And it's a debate that we always have, and I keep telling her, Mom, I really believe that the ideals, that the principles of this country are still greater than the moment that we live in today. Even if at times I feel like I'm saying it to comfort her. Even if at times you question the very thing. So when you brought that up, that's really what it was.
Thank you, Alfredo. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a short time, about 15 minutes for questions. Who would like to lead us off? Please. Can we get a microphone up here, please? Thank you. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself for the audience.
I'm Louise Shelley from the Schar School at George Mason University. You talked about people who left Mexico as that's one vote less for reform in Mexico.
That was Primitivo Rodriguez, by the way.
But you didn't talk about, and I don't know if you're talking about it in the book, of the impact of Mexican voters on the U.S. process. And what is going to happen in the future as a reaction to this?
That's a great question, and I'll take the opportunity to tell real quick about who these four guys are, because I just realized I didn't do any of that. David Suro is a restaurant owner, owns a place called Tequilas, and is also owner of Siembra Azul, Tequila Siembra Azul, Mezcal. He's now about to get into Sotol. And so I thought David sort of represented the, what do you call that? It's a term that Ambassador Sarukan has. Yes, the soft power. Soft power, right. And they, Ken Trujillo graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. It's funny because Ken was looking for his Mexicanness. We were trying to find out how American we were, or what did it mean to be American. Ken was trying to figure out what does it mean to be Mexican. Ken has ambitions to get into politics. He ran for mayor 2 years ago. He dropped out of the race when his mother was ill and later died. And Primitivo is the immigrant rights activist working for American Friends Service Committee in Chicago and then moved to Philadelphia. And he's really kind of our wise man. I mean, we all met that same evening, but we were all really looking to Primo the whole time for answers. Primo, before it was fashionable, before there was a guy named Donald Trump, but Primo was lobbying, talking about the need for Mexico to put a wall. This is back in the 1980s. And Primo felt that that especially the young, ambitious, big dreamers needed to stay back and really pressure the PRI and really try to build something. This is during the time when you had El PAN in the northern parts of Mexico, in Chihuahua, and Primo said, all that passion, it can't leave, it's got to be here. He later began the effort to give Mexicans the right to vote in the United States, along with some key friends in Chicago. Among them, Chuy Garcia, a big activist, Raul Ros. So they're the ones that were very, very key there. I think, and I've told this to Primo, I think up to now the numbers have been disappointing, but they do keep increasing. And Primo believes that there will come the day when they will make a huge difference. I think this year was, I forget the numbers, but it was record number of people who were able.
150 or so.
Yeah, which was the biggest number that we've seen. Will they ever make a difference? I mean, I want to believe they will, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And especially now, you don't really have borders, especially when it comes to social media, et cetera. I do see more and more Mexican immigrants playing a bigger role on this side. I think there was only one poll that David Ayon did in California that sort of gave you a sense of the support that Andrés Manuel López Obrador had on this side. I don't know if I answered the question, but I mean, it's something that's moving. It's something that's happening. And in Texas, I mean, Texas is a big deal. Chicago was always number one as far as people registering to vote. Dallas, for the first time, came as number two. And one of the things we're seeing in Dallas is that we're seeing a lot more middle class and a lot more binational Mexicans, people who go back and forth. I mean, it's not just the immigrant, el que llegó, the guy who's out doing construction, landscaping. I mean, these are people creating jobs, and these are people who have a lot at stake in the election here and then in the election back in Mexico.
Thank you.
What about the influence in the United States? What do you think? You talk about that a bit in the book.
About the Mexican
influence here in
Mexican American influence.
I remain very skeptical. I mean, I think they're bears in hibernation. I think that Mexicans in this country, I mean, they have to own up to it, and they have to take it. Ken is a lot more optimistic, and Ken sees a lot of parallels between California and the rest of the country. And he says, it took 187 to get people registered to vote and get them out there participating. I'm really curious to see what happens in November. I mean, I keep hearing that the numbers are up, the people registering to vote is up, but I'm a reporter, I'm skeptical.
Any other questions from our audience here today? Very quiet audience. It's because you haven't read the book yet, you see, that's the thing. Yes, please. Can we get a microphone over here, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Diane Sines. I was the first communications director for the Pew Hispanic Center. I'm a former Washington Post reporter and good friend of Diane Solis.
Oh, great. There's a lot of Pew all over this book.
Just a follow-on question. How much does cynicism enter into the equation in attitudes towards election participation? Given the political history of Mexico and endemic corruption.
You mean the influence of Mexico in the U.S.?
Yeah. Attitudes of immigrants towards participating in elections.
I mean, I think there is some of that, and I say it based on friends I know, family members I know, who say, y para qué es lo mismo, blah blah. But I really think that this election in Mexico really inspired a lot of people on this side of the border. I mean, the enthusiasm that people voted with, whether you're a panista or a priista or a morenista, I mean, there was a lot of passion out there in Mexico, and when I came back, I mean, a lot of people I've talked to were talking about that. And I remember AMLO's people. We're talking about, ojalá hayamos puesto el ejemplo, ojalá los hayamos inspirado in a way. I don't know, maybe, Andrew, maybe you can talk about that. But I did see, I mean, yeah, 70 years of PRI and all that, and people come here and they feel like, ¿para qué votamos? But I think that's changing. I really see that changing.
I mean, do you think it affects voting in the U.S. also, that Mexican immigrants are less likely to vote initially?
I think people are again, I'm cynical, I'm skeptical, but I see a lot more people preparing, planning to vote this year. And that gives me a lot of hope that they finally decided, enough is enough. And if you can't, I mean, having lived in California and having gone to the 187, I can't think of another moment that's going to inspire people more to get out and vote than that. I mean, my parents, once Cedillo said it was okay to retain your Mexican citizenship and go out and vote and become a citizen in the United States. I mean, they are the first ones every year, whether it's a school election or board or whatever it is, they're out there voting, and they make it a big deal to call every relative in California and in Texas and say, tenemos que votar. And I really, I mean, there was this little thing that Jorge Ramos did on Univision. No nos vamos a, what was it? No nos vamos a sentar, no nos vamos a callar, no nos vamos a ir. And my mother even took that out and sent it out to several people. I mean, this is it. But this is my mother. I really hope that more and more people take that as a lesson.
So in Texas, you see some movement that their voting can make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that what the gubernatorial candidate, Lupe Valdez, says is right on the money. I mean, it's not a red state. It's a really state that doesn't vote. I mean, it's not a red-blue. It's people who don't vote. And I saw what Beto O'Rourke did a few weeks ago. He took 30 people from El Paso and went to every border community, and they did all this block walking everywhere. I mean, if he has a shot, he has to get border residents, Hispanics, get him out there and vote.
There's another good, when you're done with Homelands, there's another good book out there by Manny Pastor called State of Resistance, which talks about the California experience. And his argument is that much of what California went through, the U.S. is going through as a whole, and you may see a change, including the Latino vote. But I think one of the things he would say, and other people have putting words in his mouth, but I think this is in the book, and other people have looked at this too. I mean, is Latinos tend not to vote in as large numbers for a lot of reasons until they do, right? And California and Nevada and Florida are the counterexamples. Once Latino elected officials start winning, Latinos tend to vote in fairly large numbers. I mean, there's still issues with documentation and people who aren't yet citizens and so on. So I mean, there's a lag there, but there is a notable shift actually. So, and for Republicans and Democrats, I mean, both in Nevada and Florida, it's been bipartisan. In California, it's been overwhelmingly Democratic, but a notable shift. But until that happens, like in Texas, the numbers tend to be low, and then suddenly it shifts very dramatically.
There's a lot of excitement in Texas. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really exciting to be in Texas right now, and to be from El Paso.
Lupe?
Yes, I wanted to ask you something about, yes, it's really interesting what you're saying about Texas, but Texas passed as before. And that's something that makes me think about California and Texas. Because with Pete Wilson, I mean, during that time, all these anti-immigration policies in the 1990s. And what is the difference? I mean, how you can evaluate what's happening in Texas? Because on the one hand, there is a lot of excitement about what can happen with Beto O'Rourke, but at the same time, we have, policies like as before, and no matter how, the coverage has taken place, but we still see a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And, I mean, what has happened in the two states? I mean, how you perceive the experience in the two states? What is different? Why California has reacted against the current anti-immigration
I mean,
policies.
I go back to, and maybe you can help, but what Representative Denise Moreno said when I was researching the book, she said, you know, it's very hard to compare Texas to California because in California, you had a much more political organization. The unions played a much bigger role. And Texas is still, you know, way behind in that sense. I mean, that's why I'm very, very curious as to what happens this November. I mean, how far have we come?
Alfredo, I have one last very quick question. I want to sort of end where the book begins with the restaurant, Tequila's. Okay, Tequila's is a unique restaurant. I've never been there, but the description of it that you portray, it's that they wanted to create a real Mexican restaurant that reflected genuine Mexican cuisine in a place like Philadelphia. To what extent are we close to a change of perception about Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Mexico itself here in the United States that reflects that in the same way that, you know, the Irish were despised at one point and now they're an integral part of American culture? That the Germans who came in were seen as being alien. Now, you know, it's one of the largest immigrant groups in the country and everybody sort of has a German relative. You know, to where are Italians, the same thing. Right. So where are we? Are we close to getting there with Mexicans?
Almost
Yeah?
there. I do. I mean, I really believe that. I mean, not just by the mainstream media that you see. I can't tell you the number of people who walked into Tequila's at the height of the campaign to apologize to David. And to tell David, you know, we're not them, we're not that. And these were people who were also supporting President Trump. And you know, David at one point really thought about leaving Philadelphia. In November of 2016, I mean, he called me, actually called me from a plane in Houston. And he said, this whole American dream was a myth. I'm going, I'm leaving, I'm out of here. And then he saw how people around him just rallied. And his own sons, I mean, they came. But it's not that I'm hopeful, but I see every little sign that to me points that we are there. I mean, I say, there's a passage in the book where I say, you know, we become mainstream without a fuss, without making a fuss. It just sort of happened. And it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't a Cinco de Mayo party or anything like that, but you just kind of feel it.
Yeah.
It's there. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I think that, I mean, there's more and more signs of it,
Right.
you know, with the way that cuisine culture is respected in a non-stereotypical way.
Right.
And you see the diversity of what it is to be Mexican here in the United States increasingly. You see that, you know, not every Mexican is the archetypal Mexican that is portrayed in old movies, that there are Mexicans of all different skin colors, of all different hair colors, of all different heights, of all different socioeconomic statuses, and that Mexico is much more than just mariachis and tequila. That's what I think is one of the key signs here, is that there is a greater appreciation of what Mexico actually is.
I think one of the biggest compliments I get from my own family, especially the young generations, they say, well, you know, why do you have to try to be so Mexican? We are just who we are. And I think that's really neat. I mean, I'm not a generation. I am an immigrant. And it's important to see them that they don't feel that way. They don't feel, although one of them just went to Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which is kind of ironic. And she is she's thinking of starting a Mexican-American association. It's kind of interesting.
There's something, can I ask you, I know we need to end, but like 20 seconds on this. There's something fascinating about the fact that you play with this in the background throughout the whole book, that your Mexican story in the book starts in Philadelphia, which is the birthplace of the United States. I mean, in many ways, your own story as a Mexican in the United States starts as you cross into El Paso, but your book starts in Philadelphia, which is, it's the birthplace of the nation.
Right.
And you're telling a Mexican story from Philadelphia, and you play with that in the background. Say something about that. Because that's, I mean, how much this is an American story.
I mean, I would say honestly that was one of the things that the agent liked, you know, that this was not a story being told from El Paso or somewhere in Texas. But it didn't, for me, what was interesting, and when I wanted to stay true, when I had an editor from the Wall Street Journal recruited me for months, weeks and weeks, and I kept saying, sí, mañana, sí, otro día. I was so in love with covering Chihuahua. I was so in love with covering the PAN at the moment that I did not want to leave the border. I didn't want to move to Philadelphia. But he just kept insisting. And I kept thinking, I'm also the oldest of, at the time, 8. And I didn't want, we had a little restaurant, I didn't want to leave the restaurant behind. I didn't want to leave the responsibility of my parents. And after the, I think, 4th or 5th rejection, the guy came to El Paso. And I think he kept thinking, this poor guy does not want to leave because he's Hispanic, and his parents don't want him to leave, you know, the Southwest and the family and so forth. And came over, I remember he brought with him a bottle of wine, and my parents kind of looked at each other like, oh, what do you do with wine? You know? So, my mother was making enchiladas, and we sat there and so forth. And he said, you know, I think your son has promise. And I think this country is changing. There's a lot of diversity in this country, and we need someone like him to come and tell these stories and so forth. And my mom just kind of listened to him, and you know, it made more sense to her than it made sense to me. My mother had no idea where Philadelphia was. I had no idea whether it was East Coast or West Coast or anything. But she said, would it be okay? Sure, you know, take him. If he wants to leave, yeah, take him. Not even if he wants to leave, but just take him. But can he stay for Christmas? This was November. Thanksgiving was coming up, and I felt really guilty. And I'm sitting talking to my mother, and she says, you know, when your father was getting ready to leave as a bracero, he was 17 years old. He didn't have much of a choice. His mother just thought it was important for him to leave and to carve out a new future and to do something different. It's your turn. You need to leave. And later I said, Mom, did you know where I was going? She goes, no tengo ni la más mínima idea. But when the book, when it became time to write the book, you know, the idea that it was Philadelphia and the idea that I was trying to do something that my father had done many, many years ago was, to me, a huge inspiration. You know, I thought, my father went out there to pick crops. I'm going out there to tell stories and tell their stories. And that was really what motivated me.
Thank you, Alfredo. As you said, you wanted to tell their story, but you, as you say in the book, you wanted to tell our story, right, because it's your story as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. It's been a terrific conversation.
Thank you very much.
Andrew, Guadalupe,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lupita. Thank you, Andrew.